Cynthia, I want to start by talking about how the pandemic has prompted you to rethink how you operate things over at Adobe, because you're a global company, you've got offices all around the world. How have you had to pivot as a result of not just local restrictions, but international border closures?
So that's a great question. So yes, we have had to pivot. We had to pivot to work from home. One of the things I think I'd like to start in that talking about is being prepared. Now, at Adobe, we take being prepared for different activities very seriously because we want our customers to have the highest level of service, as well as our employees having a great experience. And I have past experience with SARS when I was CIO at a shipping company. And at that time in 2004, we actually struggled to enable a group of remote workers. So last year during the California fires, I said, hey, what if our headquarters, was impacted? And what if team members that we, required to come to the office for support couldn't get there? How would we run and support the business? So we created a preparedness plan, and we didn't have to use it, which was great. But this year I had a trip to India, and coming back, it felt again like SARS. So I got with my team, we put the preparedness plan, we dusted it off, and we gave them some scenarios. I gave them some scenarios and said, what if this office had to shut down because of, what's going on in China, and different scenarios. And, it ended up, we found different components, different elements that needed to be, changed a little bit. And then, a couple of weeks later, over a weekend, we made a decision to click our entire workforce over to, work from home. And some elements did change. I mean, we had a mentality that, if anything happened in the US, we could automatically click over and, have India cover us, right? But in this case, India was in the same situation. So we had to, pivot and look at how we backed up different roles and responsibilities differently.
Ravi, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Adobe, among a number of tech companies that have pivoted to work from home, and we've already heard from the likes of Facebook and Twitter who say this is a permanent shift that is happening right now. So the question then is, what's the fundamental shift that's likely to come from this in the labor market? And you've talked about this new equilibrium that could emerge on the other end. What does that look like?
Kiko, thank you for having me on this program. Infosys, as you're aware, is a global tech and digital consulting firm. So we have 250,000 employees across the globe. So we quickly pivoted to a hybrid world, as I call it, because as I spoke about in one of my posts, we're going to go through a 4-phase equilibrium. Some of the countries are in the first phase. There is a second phase, which is before the virus really gets protected by a vaccine, where you go back and forth on demand. And then there is a third phase where you get to an equilibrium where the hybrid working is going to be a new normal, as they call it. And many CIOs I've spoken to, many tech companies I've spoken to have told me that maybe 50% of the workforce is never going to come back to work. And I would say there is a fourth phase, which is preparing for an unknown unknown. Remember, the virus is actually a known unknown. We are going to prepare for an unknown unknown, and therefore create a virtualization on demand, a resilience on demand, an infrastructure which will allow us to stretch the boundaries and make it very seamless. Coming to the labor market, I would say there has been never a time before where enterprises are going to change on all 3 dimensions: work, workplace, and workforce. Work is going to become very modular. Workplaces are going to become very hybrid, and workforces are going to become people plus gig, because work is very modular. You could take it across to different parts of the world. You could split it into small components. And with the advent of AI, I think workplaces are also going to become people plus machines plus gig. So that's the broad context in which the labor market is going to change.
Ravi, let me pick up at that point. Cynthia, there's inevitably going to be questions about the security risks that arise coming from all of this. You not only have staff in, different offices now, but working from home as well, where they don't have the same type of secure infrastructure. Are there heightened vulnerabilities that could come from this push to work from home?
So on the security front, I would say that, security is always evolving, and you have to keep on top of your defensive game in order to, make sure that you have everything in place. So, in our case, we use Adobe sanctioned devices with security. I'll give you an example. We've developed what we call a desktop as a service. And, when people want to use our software, employees or interns, we do a scan. So their equipment has to be clean. So whenever anything connects to our network, we have to make sure that the devices are clean and sanctioned. So yes, I would agree with you that there are increased vulnerabilities if you don't have the right security and defensive programs in place.
Ravi, let's talk about where all of this digitization is likely to lead to. The fear of automation, the job losses that could come with it. That was something that we had talked about even before the pandemic, but now you've got millions of people who are unemployed, worried that their skills just simply don't match sort of the future of where the labor force is going. How do you develop an infrastructure that leads to meaningful reskilling and sort of creates what you've called this chain of learning?
Okay, Kiko, that's a great question. In fact, in the United States, 40 million people have lost jobs. 70% of the people who've lost jobs do not have an undergrad degree. They either have a high school or an associate degree. I would believe this is an inflection point where we're going to move from degrees to skills. As the pandemic, just right before the pandemic, the change was very gradual, and you're going to now find this to be sudden. There was a shift to future jobs. There was a World Economic Forum report which spoke about 125 million jobs of the future being created, 75 million jobs of the past being taken away. So this is our opportunity. We have a choice to either reset back to the past or reset into the future. And if we decide to reset into the future, we need a radical reskilling, or a chain of learning, as you called it. The radical reskilling you need starts from evaluation of skills, to finding the pathways, to online training, to hand-holding and apprenticeship. And the reason why I call this a chain needed for radical reskilling is because some of our industries have got decimated, some of our work streams have got decimated. So the 40 million people who need jobs will have to pivot to jobs of the future, and will have to pivot to different industries which are proof by recession. So if we really want to do that, you need to bring a consortium of sorts with these complementary players to come together to deal with reskilling. Unlike in the past recessions, reskilling was actually owned by individuals. Reskilling has to be owned by consortiums. I have to put one last point out here. Machines and AI being a part of workplaces was always happening for the last few years. This pandemic is going to actually accelerate the embrace of machines and AI software into workplaces. So you are going to see a shift from people to people plus machines. And that shift is going to move the human endeavor to problem finding versus problem solving, which was always the trait needed in workplaces.
Yeah, no question about many trends that have been accelerated. Ravi Kumar, President of Infosys, and Cynthia Stoddard, Chief Information Officer of Adobe. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.